Well, it's no surprise to most of us that the cost of sending a child to college has gone up. In fact, new analysis shows that tuition and fees per student went up double digits in the last decade. 1 year of public education out of state now has an average price tag of $27,000. Now, there's a number of factors why tuition have gone up. One big factor is that colleges themselves have been on a spending spree, expanding campuses and buying up properties, and students are being lumped with the bill, or being stuck with the bill, we should say. Melissa Korn is a reporter at the Wall Street Journal who recently published a story on this. And Melissa, your story got a lot of people talking because that pain is real when you think about the price tag of college. But you went back and you looked at financial statements of these universities all the way back to 2002. To what extent has this kind of spending accelerated over the years?
It actually, we were only able to look back 20 years. Unfortunately, we wanted to look back longer. We think the trends could have been interesting even longer back. The spending really ramped up between 2002 and 2012. It did slow down in more recent years, in part because of the pandemic and financial pressures and pressures from the state houses of these schools. But it hasn't stopped. It hasn't declined generally. And schools are still spending more, even when you take into account inflation and enrollment increases.
Melissa, a lot of these public universities, their leaders, they blame the fact that they're not getting as much state funding as the need then to raise their tuition costs, to place more of a burden here on their students. What did you find when you looked into that?
That's definitely a very common refrain you hear from university presidents. The states cut our funding. We need to raise tuition. It's our only option. What we found looking at the numbers was that for every dollar lost in state funding, we looked at all 50 flagships, and in the states where they lost funding, for every dollar lost, they earned $2.40 in tuition revenue. They filled the hole and then kept going. They made a plenty of money to more than account for whatever state losses there were. So the tuition money was coming and being used not just to kind of replace the lost state money, but was being used to expand, to increase programs, build new buildings, add to the administrative layers, all of that.
We've seen higher education as a whole really struggle with revenue, particularly over the last few years during COVID, in part because they lost a lot of the international students who were among the highest paying, that were driving a lot of that revenue. When you consider where things are in terms of these public universities prioritizing these expansions, how much of that has changed the ratio that they see out of students versus in-state students?
Right. So some states do have very strict limits on how many students from out of state the school can have. North Carolina, for instance, has a fairly low share of students can come from out of state. So it really is serving North Carolinians. Other schools, there isn't a cap, and you've got more than half of students coming from outside the state now. Out of state students do pay more. So there is an incentive to kind of to attract them, to appeal to them, and to just try to add amenities that they think those students may want. Those tend to be higher paying students, are able to afford more because they're paying the higher rate. So they sometimes have higher standards. Schools say that they want to see these granite countertops and washer dryers in their dorms, and climbing walls, and kind of all of those easy to tick off amenities that we're seeing at college campuses all around.
Melissa, the schools that do have better oversight, or more of a, hold on their spending, any idea as to what they're doing, what their key is to success? Is it more of a data-driven model?
Yes. I think one of the most astonishing things we found in our reporting was just how little many administrators know about their own school's finances. And the standard budget model for years at a lot of these schools was called incremental budgeting, which is you take what you had last year, you add a little bit for inflation, and you give them that amount the next year. And you don't really pay attention to changes in enrollment or demand or resources. So a lot of programs that were under enrolled were getting more money than they needed, and you saw the opposite as well. And there really was no accountability. And it was really striking to hear from a lot of trustees at schools saying it took a while for us to be able to get, line item budgets or to be able to compare actual budgets against the projections that we had at the beginning of the year to see where we're off base, right? Where our forecasting is in line and out of line and how to adjust accordingly. They just weren't doing that.
Melissa, what does this ultimately mean for access to higher education? I mean, for those universities that don't necessarily have a cap on out of state, for every out of state student that comes in, I mean, that ultimately means that in-state student can't necessarily have access to affordable education, right? I mean, are we starting to see some of those numbers trickle down into community colleges, for example?
There are a lot of public universities in most states. So you've got the flagship, which is what we focused our investigation on, but there are regional universities that are often branch campuses of those flagships. So there are still plenty of destinations for students, but yeah, there's still kind of eye on the prize of that flagship main campus. And if more of those spots are going out of state, that becomes a problem for local students. It also becomes a problem as the price tag ticks higher because it's no longer, an affordable, accessible education option, which is kind of the mission of these universities to begin with.
Melissa Korn from the Wall Street Journal, really great reporting there. Appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks.